This is the representation of the kind of quality of speakers that we have here at West Hawaii Forum. And we put these monthly forums on to provide as much civic involvement and education on issues that are important to you, the community. We are one island. We are one community.
Okay, I think we're ready to start. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Jane Clement. I am the president of Community Forums, and I want to welcome you to the first event of our 2019 West Hawaii Forum series. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit organization. I'd like to introduce the board members who are here tonight, starting with our moderator, Pete Hoffmann, over here.
Good evening, folks.
Scott Ordway is manning our sound booth, and Isaiah Heyer behind you, manning our cameras, and Mike Matsukawa outside, signing people in. Again, welcome, and I would like to also welcome our speakers here tonight. Thank you for being here. Again, this is the first of many forums that we will be hosting for this year. I'd like to direct your attention to the screen over here on my right side. Next month, April 10th, is going to be our legislative forum. We will be joined by Lieutenant Governor Josh Green and State Representatives Cregan, Lowen, and Tarnas. So if you guys please let others know about this forum, and please come back April 10th. Same time, same place, 6 to 8 p.m. at West Hawaii Civic Center Council Chambers, this very room right here. This forum tonight is being recorded, and later on will be broadcasted to on Naleo TV, channel 56, I believe. And we will also be posting the video on our website, www.westhawaiiforum.org, and also on our Facebook page, facebook.com/West Hawaii Forum. And without further ado, I would like to hand this over now to our moderator, Pete Hoffmann, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Jane. And once again, coming. It's been approximately 8 months since the eruption of over in Puna has ceased, and the impacts, obviously, that that particular event and series of events have had, both as far as our county economy is concerned, also on the lives of so many people in the county, is simply a very, very significant event which will take years to overcome properly. But I think it's worthwhile at this particular event and at this particular time to take a look at the Kilauea Eruption. Let's redo where we stand at the moment, recovery and rebuilding effort that the county is undertaking, and what lessons we may have learned from this particular event of such significance to all of us, whether we live in East Hawaii or here on the west side of the island. There are 3 panelists that we have tonight. First of all, Ms. Tina Neal from the USGS Observatory over in Volcano. We have Mr. Talmadge Magno, who is our Civil Defense Director for the county, and we're very pleased to have Mr. Roy Takemoto, who's the Executive Assistant to Mayor Harry Kim. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Christina Neal. Ms. Neal has chased lava flows in a number of different places throughout the world, She started her career over here, actually, in 1983, at the initial eruption of Pu'uo'o. This was her, if you will, baptism of fire, so to speak. She spent at least 7 years here before moving on to Alaska, where I understand she covered some lava flows and ash recoveries and other things over in the Aleutian Islands. She spent a couple of months down in Quito in Ecuador and was also spending some time on behalf as a representative with the Russian observatories in the Far East as far as volcanoes are concerned, before happily returning to us in 2015 to be the scientist in charge at HVO. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ms. Tina Neal.
Okay, it's on. Thank you, Pete, very much for that introduction. So what I'd like to do with my short time of presentation before the Q&A is talk a little bit about the status of Kilauea volcano right now and Mauna Loa, and a couple of comments about lessons learned from 2008. And then hopefully I look forward to your questions when we get to that part. To begin with Kilauea, the volcano right now is relatively quiet, certainly much quieter than last summer. As Pete said, it's been about 8 months since we've really seen much activity at Kilauea. There's been very little change since the eruption ended in late summer. Currently, there's no absolutely unequivocal clear sign of magma returning to the shallow summit reservoir beneath the summit of the volcano. And I say no clear sign, no unequivocal sign, because of course there are always hints of things changing, but there's no single interpretation yet that lava is coming back to the surface. For certain, it's not coming back quickly, and it's not very shallow. And we know that primarily because gas emissions are still very low, less than 100 tons a day for the whole volcano, compared to more than 50,000 tons a day last summer. And before last summer's event, an average of about 5,000 tons a day. That number would be much higher if magma were shallow in the summit magma chamber. The East Rift Zone from the area from Pu'uo'o down to Highway 130 is showing some sign of ground deformation, meaning the ground is uplifting very, very slowly, and this is likely due to deep refilling of the Rift Zone core. That's a process that we actually saw happening at the volcano for years before the eruption. So it doesn't mean anything is imminent. This is just what the rift zones do. At Pu'uo'o Cone, it's so interesting. The lava drained away, and we've seen no activity there, of course. And now that steep inner crater is beginning to collapse, and the cone itself is starting to collapse. So there's actually been some discussion at HVO about whether we might be heading to a pit crater formation at Pu'uo'o area. Can't say for certainty, but certainly the steep crater is beginning to fall apart. You all were awakened, I'm sure, by the magnitude 5.5 in the middle of the night last couple weeks ago. That is considered an aftershock event to the 6.9 that happened almost a year ago. So it means it's related to the same sort of overall structural process that fueled the 6.9. That earthquake happened at the base of the volcano where it sits on the old ocean floor. These are common at Kilauea's south flank, and they do not. This one did not mean that we're moving towards any new event. These are to be expected. Interestingly, this current period of quiet is more than 7 months now without lava at the surface. We haven't seen this since late 79 to early 82, so it's been a long time. And those of you who live here, I'm sure, appreciate the clear air. And just personally and professionally, it's a fascinating time to be here and to be studying the volcano. Eruptions are thrilling and exciting, and we learn lots. But the volcano being quiet and making these small, subtle changes now is a time where I think we're going to learn a lot about what the volcano does in between eruptions, and hopefully this will improve our ability to forecast the next eruption. So what is next at Kilauea? Well, based on what we're seeing now, we think that activity is not likely, certainly in the coming months. There's no sign we're building towards anything. If you look at historical eruptions or events that were anywhere similar to what we went through last summer, and there's no exact replica, lava returned to the surface at volcanoes after such summit collapses and big eruptions within days to a few weeks. And interestingly, we're already well past that mark. So we're kind of in new territory. And there is no script. I want to emphasize that. The volcano does not repeat patterns perfectly, so we can't say with certainty we're in any particular pattern. But based on our best assessment, looking back at all of these eruptions, we think the next eruption is most likely to be in the summit area at Kilauea, probably in the caldera, within a few years. I know that's a broad time range, but it's the best we can do. And the next rift eruption, meaning the East Rift or Southwest Rift zone of Kilauea, perhaps not for a decade or more, if the volcano follows the same broad patterns that it has. There's a lot of uncertainty with that, so these are not specific forecasts or predictions. This also assumes that the volcano is returning to the same style of activity we've seen for a couple of hundred years now, and that is mainly production of lava flows and not explosive activity, which can occur at the summit of the volcano. Between about 1500 and 1800 AD, there were many, many explosions from the summit of the volcano. There's no evidence we're returning to that regime, but we can't rule it out. So this is just time will tell. The most important point is that over the long term, Kilauea, as you know, is a very active volcano and it will erupt again. We can count on that. And then I hope you're all familiar with this map, which is the long-term lava flow hazard map for the island of Hawaii. And it shows here, you can faintly see the laser dot for Kilauea, the red outline of lava hazard zone 1. This is the highest likely area for future lava flows. And last summer's eruption, of course, broke out right here in the red zone of hazard zone 1. The basic message of this map, that from zone 1 to 9, you're increasing you're reducing your likelihood of lava eruption, stays the same even after last year's eruption. That basic message does not change. Based on new geologic information in the past couple of decades, we probably would expand lava hazard zone 2 some distance in this direction from the summit of Mauna Loa, but it doesn't make too big a difference. Mr. Hoffmann asked me earlier if the map will be updated. We are working on some new visualizations of this information to try to make it a little easier for people to understand. So hopefully that'll be forthcoming. But the basic message is the same. The rift zones and the summit areas of especially Kilauea and Mauna Loa remain the most likely place for the next eruption. So what about Mauna Loa? Oops, not on Mauna Loa yet, sorry. Let me cover the lessons learned from last summer. So I tried to pull out what I thought would be of most interest to this audience, and my first point is the one I just made. That is that future eruptions at Kilauea and Mauna Loa are most likely again in hazard zone 1, the summit and the rift zones. Last summer, I hope, taught us all that the time frame from the initial warning message to when lava breaks the ground can be short. We had about 3 days in 2018 from the time we saw the collapse of Pu'u'o and the beginning of earthquake activity to when lava broke the surface. I think the first public message went out on May 1st, if I recall, and lava broke the surface on May 3rd. So a couple of days is not a lot of time to get organized and figure out what you're going to do. That same tenet could hold for Mauna Loa as well. Another important lesson is that lava flow paths can change during the eruption. When the eruption started in the Lower East Rift Zone, it's an area of sort of gentle topography. There wasn't an immediately perfect downhill direction depending on exactly where it broke out of the ground. And then once a lava flow starts to form, it creates topography and might divert future flows. So last summer was a good demonstration of the fact that even at the beginning of an eruption, you don't know where the lava is going to eventually end up. You have a likelihood of a certain area being inundated, but that will change through the eruption. So you have to be ready for flexibility. Especially here on the west side, VOG is a concern and means that the eruptions can impact distances from the lava flows. It's not just lava flows we're worried about. VOG and LAZE, this toxic cloud that gets produced where lava goes into the ocean, is also of concern. 2018 also taught us that we need to think about ash hazards. This is something that HVO geologists have been working on, but we really hadn't paid a ton of attention to preparing the community for ash fall. And last summer, we suddenly had to hurry up and do that and talk to people about ash hazards and what to do to protect yourself. As it turned out, it was not a desperate concern for people. Ash fall ceased about a month into things, but it could be an issue in future eruptions. So it's another hazard that people need to think about, and we need to do more education regarding. Preparing for communication challenges. Last summer, we learned that Puna, where a lot of people live, has some terrible dead zones for cell coverage. And for us, keeping in touch with our people in the field was a real challenge. We had to get very creative. And being concerned about the safety of our field parties, that was a big concern. I know it was also an issue for residents trying to stay in touch, and it remains an issue, both in Lower Puna and certainly on the west side of Mauna Loa, where we have some dead zones, and that's something that I should be working with Talmadge and his group on, and thinking about the next crisis, how to be prepared to deal with these communication vulnerabilities. But that also affects people personally as well as the authorities. And finally, my earlier point, I think that last summer should really demonstrate that all residents in potential areas of volcanic activity to think about a plan, be prepared, realize you may only have a few days if you have to move, and also know how to stay informed, how to know what's going on and get information in a timely manner. Just as a personal note, last summer when the events began, Gail and I were living in the national park, and we had to evacuate in just a couple of days. And so I shared that experience with the people of Puna to go into my house and look around and think, okay, I've got a couple of hours here, what am I going to take? Now, we were fortunate, we didn't lose the home, we ended up getting everything, so I don't want to compare myself to the people who lost everything in Puna, but it reminded me that it does take effort to prepare, to be ready, to go quickly. So, quick point about Mauna Loa, since that's also something on our minds. Quietly last summer, in the middle of all the drama, we actually downgraded the volcano 1 alert level from advisory to normal, because it had really quieted down after a couple of years of steady inflation and increased earthquake frequency. Well, of course, that didn't last too terribly long, and now we're back into a regime where we're starting to see summit inflating again, slowly. Earthquake counts are up just a titch, so we have to watch that trend to see if it continues, and if it does for much longer, or if it picks up at all, we might be back in upgrading the alert level 1 notch again. Still, I want to emphasize there's no indication that there's an eruption that's imminent at Mauna Loa, but it means we still need to be thinking about preparations and response. And last summer was certainly a good dry run for what Mauna Loa will present to us. I have to emphasize that the time frame of when and how fast the Mauna Loa eruption will occur, there's a lot of uncertainty. So that's just a given. But again, Puna 2018 reminds us of how quickly it can happen once we see that first significant earthquake swarm or very significant ground deformation change. We may have a very short time to react. A final point is something I'd like to emphasize, and that is that the 6.9 earthquake, which was in a fascinating way linked with what was going on at Kilauea last summer, reminded us that damaging earthquakes are part of living on active volcanoes. And you folks living here remember 2006, you had your own volcano-related earthquakes, even though they weren't related to an eruption. They were because of the volcano pushing on the ocean floor. Those can happen anytime. And just because we had a 6.9 last May doesn't mean we're out of a window of a potentially damaging earthquake. So that's something that should be on people's minds all the time, just in terms of being ready and thinking about it. I don't want to overemphasize this so that people are constantly frightened and paranoid, but we just live in earthquake country as well as volcano country. So I think that's all I had to present. Oh, some final slide here with just some links to how I would, if I were a resident of, as a resident of the Big Island now, stay in touch. I'd know about the HVO website where we put up information and updates. I would sign up for volcano notices at that second link there. And this way you can get pushed an email or a text message every time we put something out. And then the Hawaii County Civil Defense has also a notification service, which those of you probably getting a lot of flood and accident and high wind alerts and that sort of thing. All good ways to keep in touch. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Talmadge was a graduate of the University of Hawaii here in Hilo. He spent about 30 years as a ranger in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, was 8 years as chief ranger. He's had extensive experience and training in hazard management, and we're very pleased to know that we do have such talented and capable people in our civil defense here in the county of Hawaii. Talmadge, the floor is yours.
Hello. Good evening. Thanks for having me here, and thanks for joining us. This will be quick. I just kind of wanted to touch base on a few salient things that happened during this event, mainly covering lessons learned. When this all happened, we kind of had to fall back onto what we usually work for. Within the county, we work with all other departments pretty regularly. During any kind of activation, whether it's flooding, high surf, but that keeps us active, kind of in tune with each other. Also, we do drills all the time. Statewide, there's a drill called Makani Pahili, and that's to get ready for hurricane season. And all the state departments and the different counties practice during that event. So for us, coordination was key for ramping up for this event. And so right away we realized that, we're familiar with each other, and so when faced with such a large disaster with all these different moving parts, and especially with two operational areas, you had the Lower East Rift Zone, and then you had Kilauea Summit. So we're spread pretty thin, but able to work those areas. And like I said, we're familiar with all our partners that we work with regularly: federal government, state, county, the non-government partners as well. But during this event, we had to learn, or we had to bring in a lot of other people. And I got a slide further on that shows a pretty good list, but it's not a totally inclusive list of everybody, and that keeps growing. So coordination was key, and that's something that we'll continue with. As Tina was talking about preparation, that's something we're going to preach all along for all the disasters that we face. So collaboration. So part of our training as well is making sure that people understand our objectives, our end state that we want to achieve. And so in this event, that had to be made clear. And kind of backing up, at the end of this event, any event actually, we did an after-action review. So we identified things that worked, stuff that needed some improvement, and stuff that needed to be totally revamped. So, we had a little of each. Fortunately, we did have some successes, and we kind of made it through the event. So getting everybody so that they understand what the objectives are, the collaboration. And then finally, preparation, what I want to talk about preparation. So I think with Hawaii Volcano Observatory, with Tina, we're able to work the whole island. So we've done updates, Kona, Ocean View area, Ka'u, Hilo, for Mauna Loa. And then when Kilauea started, we were working those neighborhoods specifically, Pahoa and Ka'u as well, just to get people prepared. But like I say, that covers all the disasters, and it'll be part of the education that we need to do. You can see the first line, the last line there. So what we're working on, and this is the first, kind of the public announcement, and we're starting the planning phase, and we definitely need HVO's assistance in this. But for June 22nd, we've got this facility, and we'll have an open house here to address disaster preparedness. We'll bring in all our partners, to showcase what they do during disasters and get that out to the public. We did have one in 2017 on the east side. That was our initial plan. We had planned to do it last year on this side, but we got busy with the lava. So we'll take that opportunity this year and have it over here. One thing we did find is that the community did have some already established, resources that were able to come together And this was outside the scope of our umbrella. So we realized there's factions out there that aided the response effort that was needed. And so we're taking efforts to meet with those folks now to bring them under what's called VOAD, Volunteers in Disasters, that umbrella. And so those groups, such as those, we need to develop on the Kona side. We feel that we don't have the resources on the Kona side in case of a event like what we had at that magnitude, or anything, a tsunami, big earthquake, that we need that support on this side. So that'll be part of the preparations for our disaster training. All right, like I said, this is a list of all the agencies, different departments that helped us. A few of them that I want to touch base on. FEMA, they showed up and oops. So FEMA showed up and they were, poised to take care of anything that, they were getting ready, basically. They weren't actually called upon yet, but they were, sorry. I don't know how to stop that. So FEMA was there, and they still are working with us as far as the recovery. And like I was saying, I'll skip to VOAD, the Volunteers in Disasters. That's a big agency or big non-government agency that we want to get started on this side. They've started meeting, and other groups that we want to bring under them is the faith-based groups that were a big part as well. I just wanted to bring up the aspect of the shelters. Okay. Well, the shelters. We were activated for 139 days. 24 hours a day, so we were running whatever shifts it took. And the shelters were activated, for that period as well. They provided, services, whatever they needed. Like I said, the faith-based group picked up the slack on the other groups, and then we had another hui in Pahoa that took care of those people. But everybody came together to do what they needed to do. And you can see the period of time that we went through the sequence. The Red Cross is usually assigned the shelter responsibilities. They kind of were understaffed at this time, so our Parks and Recreation undertook that activity. Red Cross came in and supplemented them, as well as all the other nonprofit agencies. So that was a big part, dealing with about 2,000 people that had to be evacuated out of that whole lower East Rift zone. And so pretty much that's it. I'll wait for any questions after the end of the panels here. Thank you.
Talmadge, appreciate the comments. We do have some questions for you maybe at after the final presentations. Thank you. Our final presenter this evening is Mr. Roy Takemoto. Roy has been the executive assistant for Mayor Harry Kim in this administration. He was also the executive assistant at one time in the previous Harry Kim administration, and also deputy planner. If there's anyone in Harry's administration who can get things done, I think I look to Roy to be that individual. So without further ado, Roy, the floor is yours.
Good evening. So my portion is to discuss recovery. Recovery involves a lot of things. So I'll discuss the scope of recovery, where we are today with the recovery, because there was an announcement that you may have heard of that the legislature appropriated $60 million towards this effort. And then I'll summarize with some lessons learned, which there are plenty. So recovery is very unique for this disaster event. This was a very devastating event that we experienced. 700 homes destroyed, over 8,000 acres inundated by lava, over $100 million of economic impact. So how do you recover from this drastic state of affairs? We were in response mode for, like what Talmadge said, for over 100 days, which is very unusual. A typical event happens like a hurricane. A day later, it's over. And then you get into recovery. And recovery for an event like a hurricane or earthquake is clean up and move back. Not this one. So recovery is something that we had to learn on this one because it was so extensive. Recovery is not exact like volcanic science. It's not exciting like emergency response that Talmadge does. Recovery is very inexact and boring, can be boring. But recovery is so key, especially for this one, to get us back to normal. The uniqueness of this event in relation to other big recovery efforts like on the mainland with the big hurricane disasters up there is that a lava event like this one did not have a definite end. And yet we had to start the recovery because, like Talmadge said, there were people in emergency shelters about a month. So imagine yourself sleeping on a cot among a whole bunch of other people for 1 month. That is intense. So we needed to start recovery in terms of transitional shelters, to move them out. Their homes were not habitable yet, so we had to find intermediary types of shelters. And unlike other types of disasters like hurricanes, earthquakes, there is chances that you can move back. But how do you move back into land that you own that is now covered by tens of feet of lava and it's still hot and steaming? So for this one, what we are learning from this recovery effort is that ideally you want to know what you're doing, right? So you plan, and then when you're ready with your plan, then you implement. Cannot do that for this. People have immediate needs. We need to figure out short-term recovery solutions, try to get into that as quickly as possible, then maybe intermediate terms, and then at the same time do the plans for long-term recovery. So these are the types of funding sources that we learned about and have already tapped into. And it involves all levels of government, from the top. The state was amazing how the governor's office responded to us with $12 million for emergency response and another $10 million to start our recovery. Without that, the county did not have the funding to pay the overtime, to bring in the resources that we needed to respond at the scale of this event. So we're lucky that the governor was very cooperative and on our side. There are a whole bunch of federal monies that we already have secured. Big ones like a $1.7 million case management grant, $250,000 from the U.S. Economic Development Administration, and I can go on, and even private donations. What we have pending, this is which we just learned today was the $60 million from the legislature. And what we hope to secure is about $150 million from FEMA, the federal agency, emergency management agency, to help us restore our infrastructure, and hopefully another 100 or so million from the congressional allocation for what is called CDBG-DR. That stands for Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery, something like that. That money, we are working closely with our congressional delegation. So these are all the different sources of funding and how it relates to the different phases of response, near-term recovery and long-term recovery. And these are the type of priorities that we are looking at, ranging from getting people back into their homes, getting people back to work, taking care of the community, involving the community in recovery, and then building our own county's capacity to respond to future disasters, response phase as well as recovery phase. So out of this, in terms of the long term, there are very difficult policy decisions that we need to figure out. Like when we say mitigate risk, do we allow people to go back into the hazard zone 1 and 2 and have to do the same thing that we did in another eruption, or do we move them out? We haven't answered that question yet. That would be a tough one down the line that I'll get back to in this presentation. Building complete communities, what that looks like will be an outcome of the long-term range planning that we're doing. And then the economy, what that looks like. Do we just put back tourism, or can we bolster agriculture, or can we look at other new sectors, including like energy? This is just all the numbers that we're playing with. The money that we have so far with all the sources that we know about. This budget that you're looking at is about $200 million that we have to spend wisely. So, lessons learned. On the damage assessment, we were in that emergency operations center with Talmadge, and Talmadge was, I don't know how he does it. He was there night and day. I think he goes home, sleeps 1-2 hours, and he was right back. So we were in there 7 days a week. Talmadge was there 24 hours or something, I don't know. But Iron Man. But what we learned, or what we hope to learn on the damage assessment, Talmadge connected us with Hilo, and they flew drones. It's not like another disaster like flooding where you can walk to the damaged house and figure out what the damages is. We had to do the damage assessment remotely, and that's where the drones came in. So we flew the drones, it provided us beautiful images, but it told us where the lava went, but it didn't tell us what was there before the lava. And the only thing that we had pre-lava was a 5-year-old aerial photograph showing the buildings. So lessons learned there is keep an updated building footprint aerial photograph GIS system. So I think Talmadge had a contract, and we flew the drones over the areas that have not been covered yet, like Nana Valley, Hawaiian Shores, to be sure that we have a current building footprint in case this eruption happens in that area again. Recovery framework. We are building the capacity in terms of temporary positions and hiring right now. trying to figure out what we need in terms of temporary positions and finding the funding for those new hires. What we could do better is we build this framework, learning from this disaster, pass it as an ordinance. So the next disaster that happens, we already have this framework in place. We know what temporary positions to fill, who to hire, and just get everything going in terms of recovery more quickly than we're doing now. Federal assistance. The feds are great in responding to this disaster. In fact, they were more than great. I mean, they were there before the presidential declaration. And as soon as the presidential declaration came up, they stood up a disaster recovery center. And they were working with us closely, as Talmadge said, ever since the start of this disaster. But what we've learned from these guys coming from the mainland is they don't know lava. They know flooding, they know hurricane, but this lava is different. In terms of the hazards, like a house is still standing, but it's uninhabitable because of the SO2 damage to the house. But it's still standing. Are they qualified for rental assistance from FEMA? It's not damaged according to their criteria. So, we had to figure this out with them. And hopefully, both the FEMA and us have learned to better communicate, and especially for lava disasters, to be able to tweak FEMA's criteria to better fit our needs. Unmet needs funding. Okay, so there's two things happening here. First is that we didn't know what types of funding was out there. FEMA, HUD, all these acronyms, USDA, and they got pots of money, but they couldn't tell us, hey, we have this money ready for you. We had to learn what they had, and then we had to ask for the money. So one of the key terms that especially HUD keeps asking us is, what is our unmet needs? So how do you determine that when you don't even know what your needs are to begin with? How to assess that? And then in terms of unmet, what funding do we know FEMA is going to fund? So we can count on FEMA to fund that. But if FEMA is not funding, then that becomes an unmet need to HUD. So we had to juggle all these different sources to figure out finally the bottom line on what is unmet. And so that was a constant moving target that we need to get better to understand the methodology for that. Strategic communications, that is a term that we learned. Strategic communication, that's a term of art. And what that means is to communicate strategically, to know, to have a clear message, to reach people in the way that they receive information, whether it's social media, whether it's newspapers, whether it's going house to house with a flyer. And there are expertise out there that we've learned about that can help us, especially like with social media. So learning the techniques of strategic communication is something that we are learning and need to learn more about. And then this last point about mitigation. Now this is the one that we're still learning and need to figure out is whether how to relocate people out of hazard zones, and do we compensate them for moving them out? And if so, at what value? Before the disaster values or after the disaster values? So like in this case for the lava, we zeroed out the values in terms of property tax for all those properties that were covered by lava. So if we buy them out, is it at zero? Or do we somehow back into a pre-disaster value? And is it just for the land, or is it also the cost of their home? And if we do that for this disaster, what does that mean for future disasters or for other types of disasters, like if Ali Drive got flooded by sea level rise or whatever? Are they entitled to the same type of compensation? So this decision may set a precedent that may imply a lot of funding that we may not have. So some spin-off lessons for Kona and the rest of the county is that from this recovery effort, we hope to be better prepared for future recovery. But we are learning particularly a lot about affordable housing. We are going to use the money that we get from the legislature and from the governor to test some of these ideas on how we can better help tenants in need by rental subsidies or other means, how we can better incentivize landlords to rent to tenants at affordable prices by helping landlords build more cheaply with pre-approved package homes or factory-built housing modules. So all of these ideas, we're already starting and working with different partners. And those partners also include Mr. Pete Hoffmann. We're exploring with him a concept called community land trust, where we subsidize the land costs and the person would just finance the building in terms by a lease. But there it gets complicated. If you have more questions on that, Pete is the expert. So that's it. Thank you. I hope I didn't go over my time.
Thank you, Roy. Appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, I would ask that you take a few minutes. We'll take an intermission at this point. Ask you to draw up any questions that you have. Please let me have them. And in about 10 minutes, we'll open up the floor for our panelists to answer questions from the audience. Thank you.
Yep. Testing.
Overwhelmed with questions, ladies and gentlemen, I must say. But there are a number of questions that have been raised prior to this, and I'll go down this list. And please, at any time, I encourage questions that you may have. Just write them down on one of these cards that we have, and then we'll proceed from there. Are we ready? Good, Scott, thank you. First question I'd like to tackle is a question that's really not for the panelists, but it's, I would like some comments. Why is this meeting held in Kona while the disaster area is in Lower Puna, and likely the majority of disaster victims are on the east side of the island? I'd just like to take a few minutes to explain that Community Forums is an island-wide effort. We do have streaming capabilities island-wide, and we do have on our website for Community Forums all the forums that we've held for the last 2 or 3 years. I think it's important to recognize, though, that this particular significant event of the eruption is not just, although centered on people who are living or lived in the Puna area, but it impacts all of us. There is no getting away from the fact that whatever the county is going to spend and whatever resources they provide for this particular effort is going to have a significant impact on resources or lack thereof for us over here on this side of the island. It is of significant importance, I think, for all of us to recognize that we are one island. And it's not a matter of just having an event that took place in the east without some type of an impact here in Kona or in Waikoloa or in Waimea. But the point is, we do happen to be located for the most part here on the west side of the island. But I do take issue with the fact that we do have the capability for making certain that people on the east side of the island participate and are able to see and understand what these forums are. And indeed, in previous forums, we've had questions and comments from people who don't live just on the west side of the island. So I do think it's important that regardless of where the meeting is held, the information and the significance and the impact of an event like this is properly translated to people not just here, but island-wide. I'd like to have any comments from our panelists if they'd wish to chime in on any of that. Roy?
It is actually very encouraging to see concern from communities outside of the impacted area for those who have been impacted. And also that Pete is correct that resources that are diverted to the disaster actually take away from attention and resources that could have been spent in other areas of the county. So there are impacts that are direct and indirect that the whole community, the whole island should actually pay attention to and be concerned about.
Tina, would you like to add something?
I think all I'll say is that the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory tries hard to get out into all the communities in the young volcanic part of the island every year. This last January, our Volcano Awareness Month was thwarted by the government shutdown, but we're trying to reschedule some of those community presentations. But we try to be available for participation in as many community events that are appropriate as possible. And I know there's some things planned coming up for the anniversary of the onset of activity in the Puna area, and so we'll try to participate in those and be available for questions and presentations. I do think there have been a number of meetings in Pahoa, and am I correct, Roy, that the county is beginning some talk story sessions with residents in Puna? Yeah.
Thank you. Talmadge?
Yes, Pete, to expand upon that, I was over at Maui giving a talk about the eruption, and, it's beyond this county because families were sent to other counties as well. So statewide, everybody was pitching in and felt the impacts, and Maui County was asking how can they get reimbursed for their impacts, housing these families and so forth on their islands. So, it's everybody, every community is being impacted. Getting back to, the island-wide forum, like I said, June 22nd, we're going to be here in person trying to present a little bit of disaster preparedness information. We feel that kind of venue or that kind of activity, we need to be in person, but true, you're streaming live, and, the people in Puna should be listening to this as well. I think Roy had a lot of good information as well as Tina on what went on, but recovery is ongoing, and we're definitely going to share that information with them, but thanks for doing this.
Thank you. I'd just like to complete that thought, ladies and gentlemen, with the idea that education under any circumstance, regardless, is worthwhile no matter which part of the island you live in. And the lessons learned that were presented here apply, as a couple of the speakers indicated, to possible future events that could impact us directly, not just over in the Puna area. A question that we had. Roy, you did an excellent job of summarizing some of the things that the county is looking at, particularly in the advent now that we have $60 million that was the state ledge has approved for Puna disaster relief. Is there any attempt by the county to organize a special task force or a specific office that would be responsible specifically for this particular effort? And I use the example of some of the other county efforts that have been done specifically for a particular road project where one or two individuals were involved. Is there any effort to try to organize that type of an effort?
For a scale of recovery like this would be comparable to the tsunami that inundated Hilo. And in that case, what was organized, what is referred to as a redevelopment authority. It was called the Kaiko Redevelopment Authority, and what it did was actually buy out the areas damaged by the tsunami and help them to relocate residents as well as businesses outside of the tsunami zone. So the open field, the soccer fields that you see in Hilo is a result of that effort. Now that redevelopment authority, what we have today that is comparable to that, actually there's two ways that something like that can be organized. We could establish a new redevelopment authority through council resolution, or actually there is an existing redevelopment authority from the Kaiko days that the charter maintained and transferred that authority to the planning department. So we are actually looking into using that method because it already exists to use the planning department as the hub of the recovery efforts under the authority, using the authorities of this redevelopment authority, which has extraordinary statutory exemptions provided by Revised Statute Chapter 53. It's this state law on something like this called the redevelopment authority.
Okay. Would they also be responsible for the distribution or perhaps recommending where the funds would be spent?
Yeah, the redevelopment authority is, like I say, more like a hub. It would leverage the resources in other departments, work with the federal as well as state recovery coordinators, and be responsible for those multiple sources of funding that I had showed you, how to coordinate and spend those in the best way that can leverage one against the other to maximize the results.
Thank you, Roy. A question for civil defense, and I just want to see the way perhaps the attitudes have changed. In the 1990s, at that time, the Civil Defense Director, Harry Kim, said the biggest headache of Hawaii civil defense was a future eruption of Mauna Loa. Do you still think that that's true under these current circumstances?
Well, I never heard that statement from the mayor, but you know, this whole event to me started in 1983 when Pu'o went off. And the county's been under this event in eruption volcanic mode that whole period. So 1983 Pu'o, 1984 Mauna Loa, back to Pu'o, the Pu'o flow to Pahoa, then now. So, you know, we saw the volume that came out of there. But any volcano, especially in the zone 1 in populated areas, is going to be a big problem. But, you know, as was mentioned earlier, you know, we got so many different kind of hazards on this island that my headache would be a locally generated tsunami where we can't get the people off the coastlines fast enough.
Thank you, Talmadge. Let me ask you one other question, though. Do we have statistics that you have that would indicate how many people are living in lava zone 1 and 2 right now? And the reason I'm asking the question, this would give you the magnitude or, you know, the type of issue that you have. How big is this problem that you've just referred to?
Right, so I believe the proximity with lava 1 and 2, you know, puts us Lower Puna, probably 10,000 people, another 7 in the Ocean View region. So a sizable number within those areas.
Thank you. I was just wondering whether there is some identification of the number of people who currently live. I'm not saying that that was a good, bad, or indifferent decision of putting them in that area. I'm just trying to see what the extent of the issue might be for you as the Civil Defense Director.
Sure. You know, obviously, that 10,000 number was brought up. You know, it's obviously a census number, but that was a number we had to work with when we realized that we might have to evacuate that whole lower East Rift zone.
Thank you. Tina, a couple of technical questions that we got. There was I think it was a newspaper article, this is what the question seems to indicate, that the magma that originally was extruded at early May was actually magma that was left over from the 1955 or 60 eruptions and hadn't yet come to the surface. Is that true or possible, or what type of a situation do we have there?
That is the situation. You've quoted it accurately. The very first lava to come out of the ground in the first few weeks of the eruption appears to have been lava that was stored underground, perhaps from 1955 or even earlier episodes of eruption or intrusion in the Lower East Rift Zone. We've known for decades that this is possible at Kilauea and Mauna Loa, that not everything that comes close to the surface is erupted, and so you get this residual magma stored underground where it sits quite happily for decades and decades, and then when there's a new intrusion that intersects those bodies, it can actually force that material to the surface. And it has sat there long enough that it undergoes chemical changes that we can recognize with modern analytical equipment. So right now, I would fully expect there to be some residual magma from the 2008 intrusion that's sitting happily several hundred meters to a kilometer or so below the ground underneath the Lower East Rift Zone, and that may be there for the next eruption to interact with. So this just gives us some insight into the plumbing system of the volcano, and it also has some implication for the style of eruption, because older magma that's sitting around and stored for a while doesn't flow as freely as fresh, hotter magma that's more recently derived from the mantle. So there are hazard implications, and that's one of the reasons we try to rapidly analyze the samples when they come out of the ground.
Just as a follow-on question just came to my mind, just for curiosity. How deep was this magma that was sort of sitting there for 70 years or 50 years or whatever before it erupted?
Yeah, good question. I think we're still working that out. The petrologists who are studying the samples are still looking at that, but based on our long understanding of the rift zone, I would say anywhere from 500 meters to 1.5 kilometers, so 1,500 feet to 5,000 feet below the surface, something like that.
Another question, if I can, Tina, only because I think there's some confusion on the part of people, the general public, just looking at this. The idea is, well, why doesn't the county go in there and bulldoze those roads? Highway 132, the lava's stopped. Why aren't you going in there? Why isn't the county going in there and do it? But I understand that the lava is still hot down at the bottom of that. Is that true?
You are correct. The lava stays hot for a long time. These thick flows can take years to completely cool. However, as we've seen, the folks have already put in roads over those flow lobes on the way to Pohoiki, so it's possible to engineer it. It's really more a matter of policy about whether the roads are being bulldozed. But so technically it's possible. PGV has done some road building already, but you're right that it takes a long time for these lavas to completely cool.
Okay, thank you. Question. Tourism is an island-wide driver. I don't think we need much explanation of that. And it has suffered, obviously, as a result of this particular lava flow. And the VOG, or the lays, certainly that we suffered over on this side of the island. How is the county addressing this particular question right now?
Hawaii Tourism Authority has actually provided, I think, a couple $2 million to expel a lot of the myths about the volcano. Like, the volcano didn't cover the entire island. It just covered a very small fraction. So those kind of simple myths, Hawaii Tourism Authority is helping to market to correct those misunderstandings. There's a lot of money being budgeted for immediate action through the governor's $10 million, and longer term from the legislative $20 million to act on ideas to enhance or replace visitor products that were lost from the eruption. So those ideas are still being worked out. There's a economic plan with funding from the U.S. Economic Development Agency. So this plan is like $500,000 that will come up with a lot of these new ideas.
Thank you, Roy. Talmadge, in your presentation, you pointed out things that you said some things worked well for civil defense and some didn't. Could you elaborate a little on what did work and maybe one of the two things that didn't work?
Well, real quick, one thing that did work is there exists between states emergency management agreement. And so when we found, a month into it, going 24 hours a day, that we're, pretty much just worn out, we were able to use that agreement, which we put up a request to state emergency management. They put out this request nationwide, and we're able to bring resources nationwide, West Coast, Midwest, all the way to the East Coast, different teams. We had probably about 8 different rotations of different teams to come here and facilitate our operations. We realized that a prolonged event like this, we don't have the resources for that. And, when we're undergoing the eruption, that kind of fell on the heels of Kauai's floods. So the state was already supporting Kauai. So, even statewide, we're kind of stretched to support a prolonged event like this. So something like that is necessary. One thing that we found, even though these folks came in, and because nationally we operate under pretty much a uniform type of organization, and they were able to come in and function, there is some cultural orientation that we need to do to kind of make it the transition a little bit better for them. So that's, the advantages, but also something that we learned that we need to put in place when we bring these teams in.
Thank you. And perhaps one thing that didn't work?
That didn't work?
Correct. I mean, you said some things didn't work, so I was wondering what you may be alluding to.
Well, just while I was talking about the EMAC, the Emergency Management Agreement, we saw that there was some conflict or some things that didn't run as smooth as they could. And by doing cultural orientation to these mainland personnel, it would probably smooth things out and, make the operation go a lot smoother. We recognize also, and changed another thing that didn't work out, or that we could expand on, was communications. Internally and externally, not to make an excuse, but my PIO had just transferred out just as that happened. I was able to keep her on for a couple more weeks, but so at that point, I was backfilling with PIOs from pretty much state agencies. And granted, they were decent, they were good PIOs, but they're focused on their disciplines. So, to introduce somebody to lava and so forth, especially a big event like this, puts them behind the curve. There is a Joint Information Center, a JIC that it's called, in incident management. Realized that we should have set one of those up, that the press, public information would have all flowed out of that area. So that would have enhanced the communication.
Just out of curiosity, do we have to repay any of these agencies or organizations that gave us support during this time? Does the county owe them a bill of some type?
It's part of the agreement, so it's between states. So through the EMAC, it's state to state. The state will take care of that, but of course, everybody kind of taps back to the FEMA funding.
The last question I have, and then I'll again turn it over to anybody in the audience or any questions that you may have, goes, Roy, to your final point that you made about relocating people in Zone 1 and 2. And I think that has significant impact now, not just for lava zone or rift zones, but as we look ahead 20, maybe 30 years down the road, obviously with sea rise and what we should be doing. Does the administration have a particular position that they would take or that they would advocate, knowing that this type of a situation could rise again? And how will, as you point out, the questions has been raised, how would we address it not just in a rift zone, but maybe along our beaches and shores where we continue to build homes that could be in danger of sea rise in the not too distant future?
If I knew the answer to that question, I would be governor.
Well, Governor, I'm happy to support someone who would be willing to address that issue.
No, those are very complicated questions that actually the entire state, in fact, probably the nation, probably the world is trying to figure out. In light of climate change, sea level rise, all those extraordinary, severe disasters that we are getting now, the areas of hazard are just expanding so much, and mitigation is the key to the future. How do we be better prepared and reduce our exposure? So some of the alternatives that we've thought of, which we still need to figure out what the salient criteria would be to pick from these different alternatives, which one is best. We don't know what exactly those factors are yet. It could involve an ability of a family to relocate, not just in terms of income, but there may be other factors like socioeconomic, whether or not they have some strong ties to this area that they will stay no matter what. And we would need to probably respect those kind of beliefs and values. But anyway, the types of alternatives that we thought of is, one, just downzone. So by downzoning, you prevent future new construction that would aggravate the existing situation. But those who are already there can stay as what is called non-conforming uses. So you don't exactly get rid of the problem because people are still there, the existing ones. But you can hopefully gradually reduce that population over time as they grow older and no longer want to live there. A second alternative is to voluntarily buy out. So those, for whatever reason, for whatever money that you have to offer, exercise their option to take that money and go elsewhere. Third option, and a variation of that, is not to do a money exchange, but to do a land exchange. So like in Leilani, 1 acre on a rift zone, water catchment, exchange it for a 10,000 square foot lot closer to schools, services, with water, with electricity. Is that a fair exchange? So no money, but just transfer land. Third alternative, the most severe, is mandatory buyout, condemnation. So anyway, those are choices that we can think of right now. We're looking to get some wisdom from a consultant who has been through all of this and thought about it a lot. This consultant is in South Carolina. He's written books about it. So he'll be on a team that is doing our recovery plan, and hopefully we'll learn a lot from him.
Thank you, Roy. Are there any further questions, ladies and gentlemen? There's one. Go ahead.
Hi, aloha, guys. Russell Ruderman early on had proposed building new homes on state land in Lava Zone 3, kind of like shifting people. what happened with that?
That is still an option that the recovery plan will address. But the reason why it was not pushed up as a priority, there are several reasons. One is that it involves state land, so it requires the state to step up, the LNR, because all of that planning, design, and exchange is under the jurisdiction of the state. Second reason is that there are so many vacant lots in the existing Puna subdivisions. Why create more new lots when there's existing inventory there? And then kind of related to that as a third reason is that we're trying to do this planning of recovery and relocation in accordance with the existing Puna Community Development Plan. In that plan, they identified future centers where they would want to direct future population. The area that was identified for this new community, Keonepoko, was in an area that was right at the edge between lava hazard zone 2 and 3, and was not identified in the Puna Community Development Plan as an area of a future community.
Seeing no further questions, I'd ask our president, Miss Jane Clement, to please conclude and close this particular forum.
Thank you again, everybody, for being here, for sticking around. We want to thank our moderator, Pete Hoffmann, for moderating this forum tonight. And of course, we want to thank our speakers, Tina, Neal, Roy, Takemoto, and Talmadge, Magno, for being here and for the valuable information and insights you guys have provided all of us. Just as a reminder, this entire forum is being recorded and will be available. The entire video will be available on our website. And please consider our website a great source of information. All of the videos and materials from our past forums can be found there. And also want to remind you of our next forum next month, April 10th. We will have Lieutenant Governor Josh Green and Representatives Cregan, Lowen, and Tarnas here. They will be providing us with a legislative update, what's happening in the state legislature right now, and this will be moderated by our very own Ms. Sherry Bracken. And with that, again, thank you, good night, and drive home safely, everybody.
This is the representation of the kind of quality of speakers that we have here at West Hawaii Forum. And we put these monthly forums on to provide as much civic involvement and education on issues that are important to you, the community. We are one island, we are one community.